We're on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on the Black church. I really want to give you all a chance to just speak a little bit more specifically about young people, because as you've all mentioned, we've heard the statistics that they are unchurched. They are not looking for y'all in the edifice. Some of them will say, well, I have faith, I just don't need the organized religion. And that I've heard the stats that it's a particular drop-off among young people of color. So I have you all to refute that or to say to me what you're seeing on the pews, because all the saints, all the elderly saints can't be there forever. So somebody's got to be back in those pews if this institution is going to keep going. So Reverend Simmons, I'm going to start with you. What are you seeing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the young people, it's always been a challenge to engage young people, because we're far from the days of you got to get up and go to church or you don't go anyplace else, which are the days that I grew up in. But I wonder, how much are we sharing with our children and our young people in terms of our history, our roots, etc.? And certainly looking at the Gates presentation, there's so much that we older people are still learning. So I think I worry about our communication with them, that we're not talking to them enough and we're not modeling enough. That's just my opinion, because my parents and grandparents, et cetera, not only did they talk, and did they ever talk, but they modeled, they walked the walk. So I think that may be lacking in some of the things that we're doing. And we have to be genuine with young people. We can't beat around the bush, and we just can't do that. They can read us in a heartbeat.
Reverend Ross.
That's certainly at Bethel Plymouth as well.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Ross?
I think that, again, this varies, right? I think that the churches that are seeing increases in young people and engagement of young people are the churches that are willing to be forward-looking, that are willing to change. The places where we've been very stuck in our history, for good or bad, as that history may be, are the places that I think are less enticing. I think often we have employed a single model around what working for social justice looks like. That has not appealed to a lot of younger people. I think that even worship styles we've been a little bit stagnant and insisting that there is only one way or only a few ways or a few types of music, and that's been, I think, a challenge throughout the history of Black Christian faith. There's always some resistance in times of change about whether this is godly enough. But I think that is becoming a significant challenge. And I also think that, again, we are in a moment in which, as Reverend Simmons mentioned, there is not necessarily the imperative to go to church. And if people have other things they can do, and going means driving across town, it needs to be worthwhile and needs to be making a real impact in the world. So I think the question comes down to, what are we doing as church to make it enticing to young people or anybody else? And are we willing to share leadership, which is also essential?
So Reverend White-Hammond, as I said, a lot of young people say, well, I'm spiritual, I'm just not religious. Mm-hmm. And how do you answer that in your church?
So I think it's important to note that that is actually true of young people across races. And actually, Black young people have more acceptance of church than their white counterparts. Because a lot of the white folks that are in my congregation are folks who have left traditional white evangelical spaces, Catholic spaces, and who were also searching for something different. That being said, I think we approach our congregation from a design perspective. What is it that we hope to have happen? And then let's build everything else around that. Our guiding principle is we want to help people live like Jesus, not just worship him, but see him as a blueprint for their lives, which means our liturgy is not any of the traditional liturgy, because for our folks, that's not where that would lead them. And so I think the question is...
Give me an example. Give me an example of what you mean.
So we don't do any special creeds. We do have a weekly prayer that we start everything with. but it's really accessible. Every word in there is a word you would say on a regular basis. We don't sing a lot of special songs that people would naturally hear. Not that we sing none, but again, we designed our whole thing from a teaching pedagogy that said, what do we need to do that when people leave this service, they have in their mind what they're going to do this week to bring themselves in alignment with who God is calling them to be. And it's not that we're against the traditional liturgy. It just didn't reach that purpose for the crowd that we were trying to reach. So my actual lived experience is that young people don't have a problem with Jesus. They have a problem with a whole bunch of things around the institution that for them don't actually feel like they connect them with Jesus. And so my question is what's most important? I would argue it's connecting people with Jesus. And then the question is, what methodologies help people get there? And sometimes I see people so committed to, well, we've always done it this way. We can't let go of this. But my thing is, if that thing doesn't help people find Jesus, then it's idolatry to hold on to it. Let it go. And let's figure out what is helping people get there.
So, Reverend Whitehammond, I just want to add something before I go on, and that's important for people to understand your context, because you were raised in a house with two ministers in a traditional setting. So this
and
is
my grandfather was a pastor, my uncle, my godparent.
So I'm just saying that just so people understand, this is a big move for you to have assessed this and gone in a different direction.
Well, my parents were pushing the envelope a little bit themselves too, But again, I guess my whole thing, and this is actually an idea that didn't just come out of Black church, is this whole idea of centered set faith. Jesus at the center, everything else is a side note. And we've designed our worship experience in our community based on the people who are in our community that we're trying to reach. Most of them are people who've left church for some reason, and what we got to do to bring them back. So we don't have an offering. You know why? Because it's like traumatic to a lot of people, right? Cut it. We do. There are ways people sustain us. We found other ways to get it done, but we just decided anything that we think stands in the way of people asking the question, what would it take for me to live radically like Jesus? Anything that doesn't do that, we don't have time in our service for it.
Okay. Reverend Simmons, I heard you were trying to add something.
I was just thinking about being a lifetime AME when Reverend Mariam talked about offerings. And that is something that people really get hung up on. I heard somebody say one time, well, I'm not coming to church because I can't afford it. But I certainly like the idea of staying connected to Jesus, because Jesus was a radical. He really was. And he was one of justice, a man of justice. And if we get to know that Jesus, that's the Jesus we can love and appreciate, especially at times like this.
Now, you know what's interesting about that is, because all of you are saying the same thing, I'm going to come to you, Dr. Atkins-Jones, but I just wanted to add this from a personal perspective. It really is what is modeled for you, because I grew up in the most traditional, and I would say bougie, Black church in Memphis, Tennessee. However, my experience both there and at my grandmother's house, going to church with my parents, the offering was so exciting and interesting because the ritual of it, and to go to the front and play, I wasn't aware as a young person. Later, of course, I was aware that people were struggling around what to put in there, or if they had something to put in there. I was more taken with, it just seemed so exciting and interesting to all of us getting up and doing it and passing the thing and the whole 9 yards. So that's how I came away with it. It was much later before it had any negative connotation to me. So it's just interesting, isn't it? So Dr. Atkins-Jones, you want to add to the young people conversation?
Yeah, well, I think that it's really difficult because I think you have to ask young people how they're feeling and how the church is perceived. And I think that that anyone who is in ministry would say that God is a God of abundance, that there is space for multiple expressions and multiple iterations. It's not one thing or the other. And so I think if you are thinking from a service and ministry perspective, knowing your community and how do I serve? How do I speak to the people that, God has entrusted to me, God has entrusted me to be a part of. And so knowing that and being attentive to that means that, there are some folks for whom, this hymn takes me back and takes me to a certain place and does a certain kind of connection to God for me. And so I don't think that we have to operate in either ors. As a Black feminist as well, I think we can operate in the both and. I think that Jesus would have been a Black feminist, but that's a different show. So I think that, it's really important for us to say, for us to be in conversation, because I think what often is missed in some of the language around what's traditional or what's not is why this matters and where this came from. I think so much of the legacy even of the Black church is lost in rhetoric. That's to go back to my earlier point about, how the Black church does or does not get portrayed or does or does not get a media spin. It's not necessarily what it's like on lived ground or in lived experiences. As Reverend Ross spoke, most Black churches are actually very small, very local, have less than 100 people in them, and so are operating with some very different formalities than some of the big names or anyone that you would see on TV or anyone that you would even see driving a certain car or wearing a certain kind of outfit or a certain size hat, as Reverend Simmons has indicated. And so I think that we would benefit in terms of our community by being in better conversation. And I think that that's a broader intergenerational problem. That's a broader historical memory problem. It's a misremembering even of the church's role in the civil rights movement and the church's role, how the church has evolved. And so we have to reclaim our narratives. And as many preachers will say, we have to tell the story in a way that is authentic, but also that takes seriously the needs and the concerns and the voices of what's going on in our society right here and right now.
Well, I couldn't say it better with why do we do this and why does it matter? Because that's a great lead into this clip from the PBS documentary, The Black Church. And we hear about how gospel music has been an integral part of the church experience and maybe a bit of entertainment. Watch.
How do you define gospel music?
Oh, really simple. Gospel music is the sonic presentation that talks about the majesty of Jesus.
Entertainment shouldn't be in the church. What do you think the preacher does? The preacher, and there, and if what? That's entertainment.
That's just a little clip, from the documentary series. But again, as he goes further in the documentary series, and as you've said very well, Dr. Atkins Jones, just understanding where all of these customs come from. In my church, I just was always taken away with First Sunday and communion. And the old people in the church lined the hymn. For 100 years, I did not know what that was. It was just that deep moaning connection to something I knew was historical and cultural. And so, it pushed me to learn about it and to appreciate it. And I worry so much that kind of tradition will go away. And whenever I go to a church, I will never hear that again. And I don't know how we preserve that. But that, to me, is a direct connection to those folks that got off those boats and ended up, on these shores. And so I feel that, very much. I don't know if you all worry about not only not talking about why it matters and why we do this, but about how some of it just goes away because there's nobody to keep doing it.
I think that's a real challenge. And I want to just say, because I think people assume when I say we are innovating that we've thrown everything out, like just for Ash Wednesday, for 30 minutes before service, we just had a service called The Prayers That We Sing. It was a 2-minute welcome. And then on Zoom, we just listened to spirituals for 30 minutes. Just invited people to lean in to the spirit that was underneath those words. It's beautiful, but there's also something underneath them. I do think there is a challenge in many ways that's it's about more than just telling the story. And it's a conversation I'm in with young people quite often. whether or not some of the times the ways we've tried to give them certain opportunities has disconnected them from the spirit of struggle that's underneath those songs. Like sometimes I can get them to understand it intellectually, but when you live in a time where so much of your life is on a screen, it's really hard to get you to understand some of what's underneath that. So one of the things we've been doing is like, we need our young people to go outside with no screens and experience some of the connection in nature that our ancestors had, that I just don't think a lot of our young people, like in their day-to-day lives, can understand. And I don't think you can understand the Psalms if you don't know what it is to sit by a river. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's other parts of quote unquote modern life that also cause a disconnect. And I'm not sure you can just tell them to appreciate it if we don't also think about how are we creating the experiences? How are we actually making sure our young people see our folks who are in jail? Because if you don't understand the reality that our people are still struggling with bondage, how do you hear a song about a chain gang and have any level of connection to it? So I do think that there are class and modernity things that we are not thinking enough about in terms of making sure our young people have connection to the actual experiences and not just the arts or tradition that celebrate or encapsulate those experiences.
Yeah, let me just say something about that. I love the hymns because the hymns do tell the story, as my sister said. And when you said something about aligning the hymns, that brought back a lot of memories. Because that's something we're big on in the AME church, lining the hymns. Mm-hmm. And I remember in my home church having somebody who didn't really know how to do that. Went on and on. It was time for other people to sing, and she was just going on and on. So I think there are certain traditions. And when when we have hymns, I want to do a little research on that hymn and want to find out how that person felt, what they were going through when they wrote that hymn. That's vitally important to me because the hymns still speak our stories.
All right.
On this question of history, I think, and understanding the story, I wonder also if part of it is about folks who are not youth, folks who are older, being able to hear what young folks are saying, young people are saying. Because the truth is that Black folk are still catching hell in this country, right? So while it may not be the same as the experience before, there is that same sort of a moan in the soul that I think is expressed in different ways. And I'm not sure what the solution is to bridging that gap, but I don't think that, I think there are definitely are folks who are disconnected. I think a lot of folks are experiencing a type of longing and a type of mourning that is accompanying that moan in this desire to still feel like they are appreciated as fully human and fully American. I also love your reference to the offering because I think about the pageantry that surrounds sort of Black church experience. Like, I mean, if you can take asking for money and make that like some sort of regal and exciting event, then you really have mastered being, creative. And I think for me, when I think about the Black church, I just think about the radical nature of it. I mean, the idea that folks could come together while enslaved and create secret, churches and that can sustain and that across time people would respond to racism from white denominations by starting their own and transform other denominations, to me just speaks to the commitment, the radical nature, the ways in which Black folk have been willing to do whatever it takes in this country and have gone beyond and been insisted on survival in the face of whatever exists.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. I thank you all for your great wisdom and insight and the scriptures. I just want to remind you that part 2 of the PBS documentary, The Black Church, will air next Tuesday on GBH. If you can't wait, parts 1 and 2 of the documentary are streaming online now.